Hey there, welcome. Tonight, we're exploring Freya's cats and other extremely underqualified mythological chauffeurs. Because when your ride could literally kill you, you learn to trust the weirdest things. Before we settle in, let me know in the comments what small, strange thing helps you fall asleep. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. You wake up on your side in the tall grass of a golden meadow, staring straight into the unblinking eyes of a house cat. Except this one is roughly the size of a bull and purring like a distant avalanche. Its fur, a swirling mess of smoke gray and silver streaks, ripples as it stretches, yawns, and then promptly sits on your foot. You try not to flinch. After all, you have just met one of Freya's cats. Yes, those cats, the pair of divine beasts who, despite every imaginable limitation, are charged with pulling the goddess's chariot across the 9 realms. And the strangest part, they are not even trying to be majestic about it. The one looming over you, apparently named Beigel, tilts its massive head and swats half-heartedly at a butterfly before lazily flopping onto its side, crushing a tree stump beneath its hip. Somewhere behind you, the second cat, Treguel, lets out a long, theatrical yawn and flicks its tail like it has a packed schedule, and absolutely none of it involves doing anything productive. You look up, and there she is, Freya herself, stepping from the mist in gleaming armor, her cloak trimmed with falcon feathers and her amber necklace catching the light like it holds bottled lightning. She exudes a kind of beauty that is more commanding warlord than glamorous model. And when she gestures for you to climb into the chariot, you obey with the enthusiasm of someone who has just remembered cats are technically apex predators. The chariot itself is a fusion of elegance and impracticality, gold-plated, rune-carved, and wobbling ever so slightly under the shifting weight of 2 feline behemoths who appear more interested in chasing each other's tails than obeying directions. You grab the side rail as Freya clicks her tongue once. The cats rise. You do not. Within seconds, you are soaring through the sky. Not gracefully, not with poise. You are bouncing. You cling to the edge while the cats gallop through clouds, occasionally pouncing on them for fun, which causes the entire vehicle to jerk sideways. Below you, Midgard stretches in an earthy tapestry of rivers, forests, and very small people who probably think you are a comet or a regrettable hallucination. Historical records, especially from Norse mythology, consistently reference Freya's chariot being pulled by cats, described in the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson, who, to be fair, did not leave behind a manual on divine feline aerodynamics. What is often overlooked is just how impractical this choice must have been, given cats' well-documented disdain for structured activity. Historians still argue whether the cat-drawn chariot was meant symbolically, emphasizing Freya's connection to fertility and domestic life, or if the Norse just had a very specific sense of humor. The cats, meanwhile, seem to enjoy their work only when it involves minimal effort and maximum chaos. Treguel swerves to scratch an itch midair, sending the chariot into a slow spin. Beigel stops entirely to investigate what looks like a floating, squirrel-shaped cloud, which promptly bursts apart under his paw. As you steady yourself, you notice something unexpected. These cats might not be traditionally reliable, but they are clever. At one point, they synchronize a tight turn to avoid a roving flock of Valkyries, swooping with the grace of dancers, albeit very large, heavily furred ones. Freya stands calmly in the chariot, unbothered, as though the physics-defying cart beneath her is simply an extension of her will. You pass through a corridor of lightning, the sky cracking open like parchment. Freya raises one hand and the storm seems to pause, not stop, exactly, just hesitate. It is an odd power she wields, not brute force like Thor, not sly subterfuge like Loki. It is confidence so complete it makes the impossible seem routine. You pass over Alfheim, the realm of the light elves, and for a moment the cats seem almost reverent, slowing to a near hover. Down below, the rivers sparkle unnaturally, and winged figures glance skyward, mouths slightly open. Whether they are admiring Freya or simply wondering how house-sized cats can fly without flapping anything is unclear. There is an old fringe theory, mostly ignored by mainstream scholars, that Freya's cats were originally shapeshifters or minor spirits she rescued and elevated. Some versions claim they were cursed warriors, others that they were simply very determined strays with good timing. The truth, like most Norse myths, probably lies somewhere between poetic metaphor and drunken fireside storytelling. Eventually, the chariot begins its descent. The cats descend in a lazy spiral, paws brushing against the treetops of Vanaheim. They land not with grace, but with a dull hump, scattering startled birds and snapping branches. You stagger out of the chariot like someone emerging from an unplanned amusement park ride, blinking in disbelief that you are still alive and mostly upright. Beigel begins licking his paw with studied disinterest. Terjegiel chases a bug into a bush. Neither shows any awareness that they just completed a cross-realm journey that should probably earn them several medals, or at least a very large snack. Freya dismounts and pats each cat affectionately, as though they were dependable steeds and not chaos-fueled fluff missiles. She turns to you, smiles faintly, and simply says, "They are temperamental, but they are loyal." You believe her, though you also suspect that loyalty, in this case, comes with a side of purring threats. As you follow her down a mossy path, your legs still wobbly from the ride, you hear one of the cats yawn again. There is something oddly comforting about it, like a very furry thunderclap. You look back once more and find both cats staring at you with half-lidded eyes, not threatening, just evaluating. You wonder if they liked you, or if they are simply waiting to see if you drop food. You walk behind Freya into a clearing thick with violet moss and the low hum of bees that never seem to land. The cats trail lazily behind, their movements more suggestion than action. You notice Terjegiel sharpening her claws on an ancient stone rune as casually as if it were a scratching post. Beigel, not to be outdone, rolls over and flattens a fairy ring of mushrooms, then proceeds to fall asleep on it. Freya, meanwhile, continues walking, completely unbothered by the feline havoc unfolding in her wake. This, you realize, is how things work in her orbit, not through force nor coercion, but gravity. Even the chaos orbits her in a kind of grudging admiration. As you step into what appears to be a sacred grove, a soft light filters down from the canopy, the scent of wild thyme and wood smoke floating through the air. Here in Vanaheim, her home realm, everything breathes slower. The trees lean inward, almost protectively, and the wind speaks more in sighs than gusts. There is no chariot now, just Freya, her cats, and an atmosphere that seems to bend around her presence. She pauses at a pool of glassy water and kneels beside it. The cats, on cue, circle around her and flop into the undergrowth. You ease down beside a moss-covered boulder and take it all in. This is not a battlefield. This is her sanctuary. And yet, it hums with power. Historians still argue whether Vanaheim was ever meant to be understood as a literal place, or more of a spiritual metaphor, like Valhalla, or the idea of home after death. It is referenced in Norse texts, though always with a kind of narrative shrug, as if the writers themselves did not quite know where to place it. But standing here, breathing this otherworldly air, you are inclined to believe it was real, or at least real enough. The cats, of course, are not interested in metaphysics. Terjegiel is now watching a squirrel with the kind of intensity usually reserved for political debates. Freyja is chewing thoughtfully on a log, as though it might contain secrets. Freya, however, is focused on the pool. She draws her hand through the surface, creating ripples that shimmer silver, like moonlight caught in a spiderweb. She begins to speak, not to you, exactly, but to the water, or maybe through it. You see them all when you ride above, she murmurs, their cities, their pain, their strange little hopes. You do not ask who she means. You already know, mortals, all of us, you. Freya is often remembered as the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. But she is also a seer, a practitioner of cider, an ancient Norse magic associated with fate and transformation. It was a practice so revered and so feared that even Odin learned it from her, despite its reputation as being more feminine. That, of course, did not stop him. It rarely did. You wonder if this is part of her routine, a post-flight moment of quiet observation, or perhaps a form of divine paperwork. After all, gods must keep records, even if their methods are less spreadsheet and more enchanted water mirror. A fringe theory among folklore enthusiasts suggests Freya's cats were not just transport, but sentient messengers, capable of observing realms on her behalf, carrying information like living satellites with whiskers. There is little evidence for this, but when Beigel suddenly looks up, fixes you with a stare that lasts a little too long, then blinks very slowly, you wonder if he just filed a report on your current emotional state. Freya finally turns away from the pool and rises. Her eyes, still glowing faintly, land on you. "Come," she says, "there is more to see." You follow, your legs remembering their function just in time as the group moves deeper into the forest. The cats move silently now, their earlier laziness replaced by a strange alertness. The path narrows, lined with trees whose bark pulses with soft light, as if the forest has its own pulse. You begin to feel as though you are walking not through a landscape, but a story, one that has not yet decided how it ends. There is a sudden rustle in the leaves, and you catch a glimpse of something tall and spectral, a creature, half seen, all antlers and fog, slipping between trees like a whispered rumor. Freya gives no reaction. The cats, however, both freeze, ears twitching. For a heartbeat, you expect a chase or a leap. Instead, Tregegiel sneezes violently and sits down. "Spirits," Freya says, almost to herself. "Old ones. They like to watch." You nod, as if this is something you understand. You do not. The group arrives at a clearing with standing stones arranged in a pattern that feels intentional, though you cannot decipher its purpose. Freya steps into the center and raises one hand. Runes carved into the stones glow faintly. You recognize none of them, but you feel them, a vibration beneath your feet, like the world tuning itself to a quieter frequency. Beigel curls around one of the stones and begins to snore audibly. Turgle grooms herself with intense focus. You get the sense this is routine for them, like how some cats nap while their humans meditate or read ancient spells aloud in forgotten dialects. A historical record mentions that Freya would sometimes vanish for days, even weeks, from Asgard. Where she went was never clearly recorded, but some believe she returned to places like this. Circles of magic nestled in the folds of forgotten realms. Others think she sought solitude to commune with the Vanir, her original kin, whose knowledge of the natural world rivaled even the most ambitious Aesir library. Freya lowers her hand. The light fades, the air changes, thinner somehow, as if some spell has ended. The cats, of course, have not noticed. Beagle is snoring so loudly now that small animals are emerging from the underbrush just to glare at him. Turgigul is asleep, sitting up, which would be impressive if it were not so absurdly cat-like. You remain still, feeling as though you have watched something private, not secret, exactly, but sacred in a way that does not invite comment. Freya gives you a look that suggests she agrees. Then she turns and walks again, her cats following at their own unhurried pace, and you find yourself moving with them, unsure where you are going, but entirely sure you should not be anywhere else. The path twists again, and you follow Freya through a swath of ferns that part with suspicious obedience. Her cats now walk ahead of you, their pace something between a slink and a parade. They seem to know the route intimately, and occasionally Beigel glances back at you with the smugness of someone who has memorized the bus schedule to every realm in the 9 worlds. The air grows cooler as you descend into what resembles an ancient glade, full of crooked birch trees whose bark flakes like old parchment. You catch your reflection in a pool of rainwater caught between 2 stones, and for a moment it flickers with another face. Not yours, not Freya's, not even remotely human. Then it is gone. leaving only the slightly nervous reflection of someone who now regrets having second helpings of pickled herring earlier. Freya stops at a crooked tree stump and gestures for you to sit. Her cats stretch into two very large, very comfortable loafs, arranging themselves with the practiced elegance of something that has never once apologized for shedding on sacred textiles. It is here that the conversation turns, rather unexpectedly, to transportation. "You mortals are so fond of wheels," she says, folding herself onto the moss like a falling petal. "Chariots, wagons, carts, always spinning toward somewhere. You are about to defend the wheel as a marvel of ancient engineering, when Beigel coughs up what is either a small furball or the essence of your confidence." Freya smiles faintly and continues, "My cats carry me because they wish to, not because I yoke them like oxen." This surprises many. Indeed, it surprises you. The typical image of Freya's chariot being pulled by two massive house-cat-shaped war engines tends to suggest leashes, collars, and the sort of magical reins that glow dramatically in thunder. But here they are, napping, occasionally twitching. Hardly the image of beasts of burden. Historians still argue whether the cats were literal animals, spiritual projections, or exaggerated symbols of Freya's Vanir roots, nature-bound, independent, and a little unpredictable. The prose Edda describes them as pulling her chariot, yes, but leaves out details like their origin, temperament, or veterinary costs. Some even posit they may not have been cats at all, but lynxes, or even mythic felines the size of oxen, which, to be fair, is the kind of cat every deity with self-respect deserves. There is a Danish folk tale, likely apocryphal, but deeply entertaining, that describes how Freya's cats once refused to move her chariot for a full week because they were having an existential disagreement over which constellation was the most flattering to be seen under. It ends with Freya bribing them with a single enchanted sardine, possibly symbolic, possibly just cats being cats. You watch as Tryggio lifts one leg lazily into the air and begins grooming her stomach with such violent dedication that the ground around her starts to tremble. It is difficult to imagine this creature charging through the sky, hauling a golden chariot and a goddess, yet here you are. Freya draws your attention to a patch of wildflowers, shaped almost like hoofprints. She tells you this is where they usually take off. There is no great fanfare, she says. No battle cry. They simply leap, and the ground is behind us. You imagine it. No rockets, no roaring winds. Just two immense cats deciding the laws of physics are not for them today. Up they go, paws skimming clouds, their tails twitching as they pass through the upper atmosphere. You picture them batting aside thunderheads like toys, entirely unimpressed by the weather patterns of Midgard. A breeze ruffles the trees above. Freya tilts her head. They choose when to run, she adds, and when to rest. I simply trust them. It is a kind of faith, you realize, to rely on something so willful and so occasionally ridiculous. But perhaps that is the point. In a world of swords and storm gods and frost giants, to place your fate in the paws of creatures who nap through apocalypses is to commit to a very specific kind of power. A historical note, often overlooked, is that Norse deities, for all their grandeur, were not necessarily admired for their strength alone. Cleverness, stubbornness, and boldness all ranked equally high. Freya's choice of transportation was not just whimsical, it was a flex, a statement that she did not need dragons or flying horses. She had cats, and they got the job done, or mostly did. There is one fringe tale surviving in a half-burnt Icelandic manuscript that claims the cats once got lost on the way to a war council and accidentally invaded a wedding in Alfheim. They reportedly drank all the mead, knocked over the sacred candles, and slept in the gift baskets. Freya was politely asked never to bring them again. Now, here in this quiet glade, you watch as the cats stretch and begin to circle. Freya rises and brushes something invisible from her cloak. The air tightens again, as if reality is considering shifting. She looks at you. Would you like to see? You do not need to ask what she means. The answer forms in your mouth like dew. Yes. Turgle and Beagle move to the center of the hoofprint flowers. Their eyes glow faintly. Freya steps between them, placing a hand on each head. They purr in stereo, a sound that vibrates not in your ears, but somewhere behind your ribs. The wind hushes. Then, without a sound, the cats leap forward, straight up, and vanish into the sky. You blink, they are gone. Freya turns to you, calm and grounded as ever, as if she has not just defied several laws of physics and good sense. They will return, she says, as if she is talking about a slightly moody train service. You stare at the patch of wildflowers, already growing back into place. They always do. Your legs feel light, as though some part of you briefly left the ground, along with those cats. Freya, still beside you, adjusts the fall of her cloak with a practiced motion, then begins walking again. Through the trees and over stone, back toward something that feels like a center. As she moves, you follow, and your mind catches up slowly, like a sleepwalker, returning from an odd but somehow sensible dream. She begins speaking again, her tone soft, but with that strange ring of inevitability, like she is telling you something you already know but had forgotten. There are others, she says, who fly, drive, or crash their way through the skies of myth. Not all of them are efficient. You glance upward, half expecting to see some divine traffic jam in the clouds. But there is only sky and the soft rustle of leaves. You walk together, past a knotted tree root that looks suspiciously like Thor's hammer if viewed from a certain angle. Freya seems amused by it. Take Thor, she says, confirming your thought. He requires goats. You blink. Yes, the thunder god's chariot is pulled by 2 goats, Tangersnir and Tangenjos, names which translate roughly to tooth-grinder and tooth-gnasher. They are not metaphors. They are actual magical goats that pull Thor across the sky and, when necessary, through space itself. At night, he eats them. By morning, he resurrects them with Mjolnir, as long as their bones remain unbroken. Thor forgets sometimes, Freya adds, that marrow is not a snack. Historians still argue whether the goat chariot was symbolic of fertility rites, shamanic flight, or simply a reflection of Norse practicality. Goats were a common, useful animal. They cleared fields, fed families, and, in Thor's case, facilitated interdimensional transport. A few sagas even mention them chewing through enemies when needed. Tactical goats, if you will. You picture it now, the most muscular of gods, thunder in his beard, barreling through the clouds in a goat-drawn chariot. It is both majestic and slightly ridiculous. You suspect that is exactly the point. Next comes Odin. You do not even need Freya to prompt you. His name drifts into your thoughts like mist. The Allfather does not bother with animals, not for transport. He has Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse, gray, swift, born of Loki, and capable of galloping between worlds like it is trotting down a dirt road. Freya confirms it with a nod. He prefers his horse, she says, because it is faster than thought. That is not poetic exaggeration. The prose Ida and Gylfaginning describe Sleipnir as the best of all horses, capable of moving through the 9 realms without rest. In mythology, he is not just a mount. He is a symbol of shamanic travel, of dream states, and altered consciousness. Some fringe scholars have argued he represents the trans-journeys of Norse seers, who described flying between realms during vision quests. You wonder what kind of boarding pass that requires. Then there is Heimdall, the ever-watchful guardian of Bifrost. He rides the golden-maned horse Gulltoppr, though one might argue he does not do much actual traveling. His station is fixed. He waits, eyes wide open, watching and listening for the horn blast that signals the world's final chapter. His transportation is more ceremonial than practical. Still, it sparkles. And let us not forget Hel. Not the place, though you will not forget that either. After stepping near its shadow, but the goddess, her preferred mode of movement is never quite explained. She is simply there when needed, often ahead of schedule, and never late. Some think she travels through shadows. Some say she commands a carriage drawn by skeletal wolves, but that might be a later invention from Gothic embroidery, or heavy metal album covers. Freya's voice cuts softly through your thoughts. They all have their ways, but none of them trust cats. You nod. Understandable. A quirky Norse tidbit you recall, though Freya never confirms or denies, is the strange belief in certain regions of Iceland that black cats could detect trolls. Some households even kept them for that purpose, though their reliability was apparently mixed. One cat famously alerted its household to a troll invasion that turned out to be a wedding party arriving in fog. Still, better safe than eaten. The line between animal and mythic vehicle was blurry in these stories. Horses, wolves, goats, cats, they were not just companions, they were conduits, between here and there, between now and then, between what you think you know and what waits on the other side of dawn. You emerge from the woods into a clearing of pale stone slabs, arranged like the teeth of a sleeping giant. Freya walks to the center and places a single sprig of mugwort on the stone. For the journey, she murmurs. Then she turns to you. There are those, she says, who fly by storm. There are those who ride by rune. And there are those, her eyes flicker upward, who get there when they feel like it. You hear a distant meow, very faint, very smug. Freya folds her arms. They are returning. The clouds begin to ripple, not like they are moving, but like they are being displaced by something unseen, approaching fast. You step back instinctively as the air folds in on itself. Then, with a sound like silk tearing, Tergul and Beigel land at the edge of the stone ring, perfectly composed. Not a whisker out of place. You swear. Beigel winks. Freya pets each cat once, precisely, then turns to you. Next time, she says, we fly. You are not sure whether to be thrilled or terrified. The cats stretch, long, slow, and smug, like they just returned from brunch in Alfheim, completely unbothered by the laws of gravity or time. Torjegil gives a single, delicate sneeze that somehow feels passive-aggressive, and Beigel licks a paw, ignoring you like only a feline with divine status can. You stare at them. These are not ordinary cats. That much is obvious. But what are they? How does a creature become the chosen steed of a goddess like Freya? Did they audition? Were there tryouts? Or did some ancient feline simply jump into her lap one day and never leave? Freya walks again, and, of course, you follow. You wonder how they came to me, she says, without turning her head. It was not planned, which, considering how much mythology depends on fate and threads spun by Norns, is oddly comforting. Even goddesses can be surprised. According to some historical interpretations, the cats pulling Freya's chariot were a later poetic invention, skaldic flourishes added to elevate her grandeur. Yet others argue that they reflect very real Norse folk beliefs, where cats were sacred creatures linked to fertility, protection, and the domestic sphere. Farmers would often protect cats and leave offerings for them, believing that they brought luck, good harvests, and even kept away evil spirits. Cats were both magical and mundane, soft, purring house spirits and tiny predator gods. That dual nature suited Freya perfectly. You arrive at a low hilltop where the grass leans toward the wind and the horizon appears closer than it should be. Tregegiel and Beigel leap forward, climbing a small boulder, surveying the land like seasoned generals or possibly lazy landlords. Freya sits upon a stone and pats the ground beside her. You comply. She begins speaking, her voice mellow, almost like a lullaby. There are stories, she says, about cats who spoke, about cats who judged men's souls, about cats who curled up beside witches, not as pets, but as partners. Indeed, in Norse settlements, cats appear in grave goods, sometimes buried beside their owners, or with elaborate care. A cat skeleton found at an excavation in Oseberg, for example, was laid to rest in a burial ship filled with other animals, possibly symbolic of that owner's power and relationship to magic. Historians still argue whether Freya's chariot was ever meant to be taken literally, or if it was metaphor, her cats symbolizing the intimate relationship between the divine feminine and the domestic, the wild and the gentle. Or perhaps it is both. After all, What is more powerful than a being who can ride a storm and get blood out of linen? You shift on the mossy earth. The cats are now clearly eavesdropping. Freya smiles slightly. They hear everything. You can believe it. There is something ancient about these two. Not old like dusty books, but old like glaciers or fire. Maybe they were not made to be hers. Maybe they simply decided to be. A fringe legend you once stumbled across on the edge of a half-translated saga suggested that Tregegial and Beigel were not cats at all originally, but minor spirits of wind and shadow, who took feline form after being caught in a storm woven by the Vanir. One version even claimed they had once been rats, transformed by Freya herself as a favor to an unnamed seer. Rats, of course, being far too undignified for divine transport. The cats would deny it, obviously. Beigel glances at you with the kind of look that says, "You are very fortunate to be here, and we are barely tolerating your presence." Tregegial yawns so wide you briefly wonder if you can see into another dimension. Freya draws a line in the earth with a twig. They travel when they wish. I do not command them. You glance again at the so-called steed duo, now settling into a nap that looks suspiciously choreographed. They permit me to travel with them, she continues. That is the difference. You nod slowly. There is a strange sort of power in not controlling, but collaborating with creatures, with magic, even with chaos. Cats are not horses. They do not carry out orders. They negotiate. You begin to understand why Freya, goddess of war and love, chose cats, or perhaps why cats chose her. The sky overhead begins to dim. Not with storm clouds, but that quiet hush before twilight, when the air softens and everything seems wrapped in velvet. Freya rests her head back against the stone. They carried me into battle once, she says, not to fight, but to be seen. That image strikes you, Freya descending from the heavens in a chariot drawn by cats, radiant and terrifying, not because she wielded weapons, but because she refused to. Freya does not conquer. She chooses, and her chosen ride, velvet-pawed judgment with built-in murder mittens. Some mainstream sources, such as the prose Ida Doulis, her riding a chariot, but never linger on the details. It is the later interpretations, the folktellings and poetic flourishes, that give us the cats, which leaves the door wide open for playful, reverent creativity. And cats, of course, would prefer it that way. You lie back in the grass. The warmth of the day is fading, replaced by that soft hush only evening can bring. The moss cushions your neck. The wind smells of mugwort, smoke, and something vaguely metallic, perhaps the scent of a vanished battle. Above you, Tregegial opens one eye. A low, satisfied purr vibrates through the earth. Freya whispers, "They will take us when the hour comes." You ask, "When is that?" She shrugs, "When they decide." Of course. The cats vanish. One moment they are curled like watchful statues under the growing dusk, and the next there is only flattened grass and the faintest scent of cedar and fir. You blink and the landscape seems emptier, like part of the sky has folded itself away. Freya stands without haste. They will return. They always do. You follow her again, this time into a grove where the trees lean together like gossiping neighbors. The bark is silvered, and every branch seems to whisper something in a tongue you nearly understand. The moon rises like a slow coin, pale and deliberate. "Now," Freya says, "let us speak of other drivers." You do not ask who. You already know this is not a conversation about chariots. It is about mythological transportation, yes, but more than that, it is about control, trust, and divine absurdity. Because, let us be honest, very few mythological beings should ever have been allowed behind the reins. And yet, here we are. She gestures, and a tree leans just enough to form a sort of seat. You sit, and she does too, draping herself across a root like it was placed there for her centuries ago. "Thor's goats," she says, as though naming a mild weather event. "Ah yes, Tangrisnir," and literally means tooth grinder and tooth gnasher. You recall they pull his chariot with the sort of energy that suggests they may not be entirely sane. In the myths, Freya explains, he slaughters them for dinner, then resurrects them the next morning from their bones, which, frankly, is either a brilliant form of divine sustainability or a deeply unsettling mealtime tradition. Perhaps both. Mainstream historical sources do record this curious cycle, Thor traveling with his goats, eating them, then reviving them with Melnir, provided the bones remained unbroken. In one tale, a mortal cracks one for the marrow, and the goat returns with a limp, which Thor notices. He is not pleased. Historians still argue whether this ritual was ever performed symbolically by Norse worshippers. Goat sacrifice and resurrection as a cycle of strength, death, and restoration, or if it was simply mythic theater. Regardless, the goats remain one of the more metal transportation options in mythology. You glance at Freya, who nods slowly. Their hooves strike lightning, their breath carries storms, and they smell, she adds, unspeakably bad. Another mythological mode of transport that comes to mind is Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, a gift from Loki, oddly enough. Born of Loki, actually, if we are being precise, in the form of a mare, after distracting a giant's stallion. Yes, mythology gets complicated fast. Sleipnir, sleek and gray, moves faster than thought. The ultimate ride, which raises the question, if Odin has the best horse, and Thor has resurrection goats, and Freya has cats, does that make her the eccentric cousin, or the most sane of the bunch? You suspect the latter. Freya continues, there were others, long forgotten. A sea serpent that ferried, injured across dreams. A living wheel pulled by songs. A cloak of feathers that flew faster than speech. That last one sounds familiar. Loki used it once, did he not? She smirks. He borrowed it, without asking. Classic. Then there are the humans, she says, voice light, always trying to match our absurdity. Indeed, the Norse sagas are filled with men attempting to tame beasts and machines they barely understand. Chariots pulled by wolves, skiffs dragged across snowfields by elk. One Icelandic folktale even describes a berserker tying himself to a barrel of fish and letting the river decide his fate. That story, you recall, does not end well. Freya traces a line in the dirt with her finger. Transportation, she says, is always about power. Who controls the movement? Who decides the direction? You nod. It makes sense, of course. In a pantheon built on chaos, travel is not just practical, it is symbolic. The gods move when they will, often by the strangest means possible, and their rides, often wild or sentient or barely manageable, reflect that instability. A fringe tale flickers in your memory, one not often told. It describes a minor goddess who rode a carriage of starlings. They lifted her above the battlefield, invisible, except for the sound of wings. Some say she was Freya's sister. Others claim she never existed. Historians still debate whether the tale was a corrupted fragment of a larger poem or an invention from post-Christian scribes, adding soft grace to Norse myth. Either way, the image lingers. Wings instead of wheels, music instead of muscle. Back in the grove, the wind hums. Freya stands, brushing invisible dust from her skirts. Some of us choose cats, she says, not for their strength, but their disinterest. You blink. They go where they wish. You must persuade them. It is a test, you realize, not of control, but of worthiness. Perhaps that is the secret. Gods do not always ride the mighty beasts. Sometimes they travel with creatures who cannot be forced. And those rides, those smug, unhurried, terrifyingly independent rides, are the ones that tell you who you really are. The trees lean in just a little more, eavesdropping. Somewhere far off, thunder mumbles, not a threat, just a reminder that somewhere Thor is probably having another roast goat dinner. The moon is higher now, silver, cut with cloud. Freya begins walking again, and you follow. The earth is softer underfoot. The air smells of frost and pine. You do not know where you are going, but the path feels familiar. At your side, something brushes your hand. Beagle, or is it Tregegual? Difficult to say. The cat does not explain, and you know better than to ask. It merely glances up at you, then then continues walking ahead. And just like that, the chauffeur is back. The cat, whichever it may be, walks like it owns the forest. Its paws do not disturb a single pine needle, nor snap the brittle twigs beneath. The way it moves, silky, soundless, and supremely unimpressed, suggests it was never meant to serve anyone, even Freya. You follow behind, careful not to seem like you are following at all. It seems polite. Freya walks a few paces behind the creature, letting it lead. You wonder if this is a habit among gods, or simply a necessity. You would wager the latter. After all, when your chariot runs on feline energy, you do not drive so much as suggest a direction and hope. She says, without turning, there are rules for who may drive whom. Most forget that. You almost reply, but the wind is carrying sounds, scrapes, rustles, a low groan like an ancient branch, bending under the weight of years. No threat, just the world shifting itself around the story. You listen. Freya continues. The Romans gave chariots to everyone. Gods, emperors, victorious generals. They loved a parade. But we have fewer victories. We do not celebrate in advance. She gestures at the sky. That is historically accurate. In Roman tradition, the triumph parade was an event of pageantry, complete with golden chariots pulled by white horses, surrounded by captives and treasures. Jupiter himself was often invoked in these parades, sometimes impersonated by the triumphant general. They knew how to put on a show. The Norse were different. Their myths do not lean on spectacle. Instead, they embed their grandeur in strange places, run stones, cryptic poetry, the gleam of a weapon with a name longer than its blade. Freya's voice, soft now, pulls you back. Our chariots are not for parades, they are for work. You glance at the cat. That counts, she says, without looking. You are not going to argue with someone whose battle necklace is made of tears and whose ride is a feline Uber. She stops by a stream. The water glows faintly with reflected starlight, and you notice, quite suddenly, how tired your feet are. It has not felt like a journey, but your body disagrees. Freya kneels and places a hand in the water. We tell stories of chariots to explain control, but sometimes the vehicle controls the god. You are not sure if she means that metaphorically or literally, but either way, it lands with weight. She gestures toward a mossy boulder. You sit, expecting one of those cryptic, divine monologues. Instead, she simply asks, "Do you know how many gods have been dragged by what they once commanded?" The list begins forming in your head. It is longer than you expect. There is Balder, carried unwillingly into Hel's domain. Tyr, dragged by Fenrir's jaws into legend. Skadi, stomping into Asgard, demanding justice, and ending up with Njord and a foot-based matchmaking system that historians still argue whether was satire or ritual. Then, of course, there is Njord himself, god of the sea, who tried to live inland and found the gulls unbearable. Transportation in reverse. No chariot, just a relocation gone wildly wrong. One quirky bit, some fringe scholars suggest. Skadi's infamous choice of Njord's feet over Baldr's face may have roots in older Indo-European bride show rituals, where symbolic body parts were substituted for identity. A literal foot-and-mouth selection, mythology rarely lacks for awkward symbolism. Freya, watching your face, nods. Sometimes a god rides a creature, she says. Sometimes a creature rides the god's fate. It is not comforting. But then she smiles. That is why I chose cats. The stream flickers as something moves beneath the surface. Not fish, bigger. They know how to vanish, she says. And more importantly, when not to return. You remember a folktale, not widely known, about a mortal who tried to summon Freya's cats with cream and poetry. It is said the cats appeared, stared him down, then rearranged his furniture for reasons never explained. The story ends with him writing a series of unsuccessful odes to more cooperative livestock. Historians still debate whether the tale was meant as a parody of skaldic poetry or a lesson in humility. Either way, it is oddly satisfying. Freya stands again, brushing her hands against her skirt. You have seen the forests, the rules, and the riders, but there is one more journey left. You look up, where she points, not forward, but up, home. You expect a poetic gesture, a whisper to the heavens, a slow ascent on a beam of moonlight. Instead, the cat hops up onto the boulder beside you and sits. You blink. Another joins it. They stare at you with identical expressions, blank, judging, feline. Freya merely lifts an eyebrow. You sigh, because you know what is coming. The cats are going to drive. The fur is softer than you expect, but also a little static charged, like brushing against a thundercloud, wearing a velvet coat. You perch awkwardly on the makeshift platform nestled between the two massive cats, somewhere between divine chariot seat and wobbly picnic bench, and grip the braided leather cords Freya hands you with visible amusement. You are not steering. You are barely holding on. The cats move, not a run, not a trot, but an elegant, disdainful levitation. Their paws skim over the grass without touching it. Trees bend slightly to let them pass. Somewhere in the distance, a raven coughs, then decides against commenting. You are ascending, not into a glowing light or a staircase of clouds. You float up through a column of twilight, the world below becoming layers of blue, then shadow, then memory. The cats blink in sync, and you swear they exchange a private joke at your expense. You pass by branches, not ordinary ones. These are thick, gnarled world tree branches, Yggdrasil itself, if the scratch marks are anything to go by. The bark smells of old winters and burnt offerings. Below you now, a glinting pool of water, reflecting not your face, but a version of yourself from childhood. The cats do not pause to let you feel anything about it. They are drivers, not therapists. Eventually, the motion slows. You drift toward a landing spot that looks suspiciously like a rest area on a divine motorway. There is a small stone archway, under which a faded sign reads, Reincarnation Processing, Department of Interim Bodies. You look at Freya. She shrugs. Even cats need somewhere to recharge. She is not joking. The cats stretch, yawn, then promptly curl up by a pool of silver mist and fall asleep. You disembark, knees wobbly, and follow Freya into the mist. It is surprisingly warm, the sort of warm you feel inside a wool sweater after tea, while half asleep during a storm, and the scent earthy, comforting, like a pile of autumn leaves soaked in memory. You glance sideways at a row of empty shapes. They are cat-shaped, vaguely, not sculptures, not shadows, potential, waiting. Freya rests her hand on one of them. They do not last forever. No body does. You had not really considered that mythological cats might die, or retire, or burn out. Even these, you ask. She nods. Especially these. One mainstream belief among Norse scholars is that Freya's cats, often unnamed, were not ordinary animals, but spirits, or fylgir, accompanying souls that sometimes took feline form. If that theory is correct, then these shapes might be those spirits waiting for a host again. Historians still argue whether Freya's cats were divine beings in their own right, or merely enchanted beasts, Freya murmurs, not looking at you. And what happens when a god's mount ceases to be? Does the god walk? Borrow a horse? File paperwork? You are tempted to ask, but something tells you the answer is too heavy for a chariot ride. Instead, you sit beside the pool and watch one of the sleeping cats twitch. A paw moves in a dream. Maybe it is dreaming of fields, or mice, or biting Loki, which is a favorite pastime of divine animals. You recall an obscure Icelandic tale that claims the cats vanish into dreams between errands. They wander human minds, curling up on chests and whispering secrets to sleeping ears. If you have ever dreamt of fur and falling, perhaps you have hosted one without knowing. You stretch your arms and lean back. For a moment, the pace of the world aligns with your breathing. No movement, no urgency, just purring and silence. Then Freya stands. They will wake soon, she says, and we have more to see. You climb back onto the chariot, which is now cooler, somehow lighter. The cats rise and stretch with fluid disinterest, then take position without being asked. They are professionals, or at least very bored interns. As you lift off once more, you look back at the pool. The mist ripples. One of the empty cat shapes is gone. You wonder if someone, somewhere, just found a kitten on their doorstep. The return path is not the same. That would be too easy. Instead, the cat spiraled downward through a tunnel of shifting colors. Reds, golds, occasional flashes of bright pink. As if reality took a wrong turn through a modern art exhibit. As you descend, you pass glimpses of stories not yet told. A wolf gnawing through its chain, a tree dripping blood, a field where swords grow like grass, and a chariot, empty, forgotten in the snow. You do not ask, you do not need to. The cats land with the gentlest thump. You are back. Somewhere in Asgard's softer outskirts, where the air smells like thunder and baked bread. The trees are tall but polite. The sky is tired but not stormy. Freya dismounts and brushes down her gown. You rode well, she says, not quite smiling. You glance at the cats. They have already begun grooming each other, as if the whole journey was a mildly annoying errand. Their work is done. Almost. There is one more trip. You shift in your seat again, trying to convince your body that the last journey was not a dream. That you truly did float among world tree branches, with divine cats barely tolerating your presence. They are still here, after all, flicking their tails with the kind of barely concealed contempt only cats can manage, celestial or otherwise. Freya rests a hand on the chariot's frame. It hums under her touch. One more, she says, like it is the final errand of a long day. But this destination feels different. The sky darkens, not menacingly, just enough to suggest this place might hold something heavy. You grip the cords again. The cats, perhaps sensing the shift, rise without their usual lazy arrogance. The chariot moves. This time it is not flying or floating. It is falling, but gently, like drifting down a slope slicked with memory. You pass through a veil of scent, lavender, iron, and that unmistakable, earthy undertone of something old and powerful. Not dead, just waiting. Below, the land flattens. You arrive in a place that feels like a cross between a battlefield and a meadow. Spears once stood here like forests. Now, only the wind lingers, whispering through the remains. The grass has grown back, but grudgingly. The flowers are pale, like they remember what came before. This is Folkvangr, not as famous as Valhalla, but every bit as sacred. Here, Freya gathers her share of the slain, those who fall in honor, but not necessarily in a way that Odin approves of. It is quieter than Valhalla. No endless mead halls, no shouting warriors wrestling each other for fun. Here, the fallen rest, they heal. They remember who they were. Historians still argue whether Folkvangr predates Valhalla in mythic tradition, or if it was a later addition meant to balance Odin's growing narrative dominance, Freya says, leading you through the high grass. The cats do not follow. They sit at the edge, eyes gleaming, guards, escorts, or maybe just disinterested bystanders who know better than to tread too far into the peace of the dead. You walk beside Freya, feet brushing soft moss and old petals. You pass a stone marked with runes, not loud ones, not boastful, but gentle. Names, faces, lives. You do not speak. Even your thoughts begin to whisper. A figure waves from the distance. Not in welcome, exactly, but in acknowledgement. You raise your hand without thinking. There is no fear. Only that aching, quiet respect that comes from knowing something greater has touched the place where you stand. Somewhere nearby, a small hall glows with inner light. Inside, women gather. They are not weeping. They are sewing, mending tunics, fixing spear straps, braiding each other's hair. They are warriors, yes, but more than that. They are living memory, stories made flesh, resting between verses. You see a cat walk past the hall's doorway, smaller than Freya's chariot pullers, but unmistakably kin. The same arrogance in its stride, the same otherworldly shimmer. It stops and looks at you with eyes full of things you do not yet understand. A quirk of folklore states that cats were guardians of the boundary between life and death. In Norse traditions, Cats were sacred, not just for their mystery, but their independence. To serve Freya was to understand both war and softness, ferocity and repose. The cat blinks once, then vanishes behind a woven curtain. You reach a low stone wall covered in moss. Freya pauses there. Some do not cross beyond this, she says. They stay in this in-between until they are ready. She does not say, for what? Rebirth, rest, revenge. It is not for you to know. A breeze picks up, carrying with it the sound of distant purring. You glance back. The two cats have not moved, but their eyes follow everything, patient, eternal, probably judging your posture. Freya lowers herself onto the wall. You sit beside her. The silence is not awkward. It is earned. People forget, she says after a while, that we are more than war, more than fire and steel and screaming. There is beauty in stillness, in choosing not to fight. Sometimes you nod, because words would ruin it. A curious detail, preserved in some lesser-known sources, such as 19th century folklore collections, suggests Freya was once considered a goddess of prophecy as well. Not just love and battle, but knowing, seeing what others could not. You wonder if she is seeing something now. You wonder if she sees you. You stand, eventually. You do not want to. But the cats are restless now, pacing, their tails flicking in synchronicity, like pendulums of a cosmic clock. The journey is almost over. Freya dusts off her gown. The moss does not stick to her. Of course it does not. Back on the chariot, the cats spring forward before you even settle in. This time, it is not up or down, but sideways, like slipping between pages of a very old book. The sky does not change, but your understanding of it does. You pass clouds that are not clouds, but the memory of breath. You see stars flicker and wonder if they too are watching. The landing is soft. You are back where you began, or close enough. The cats slow to a stop. One yawns dramatically. The other licks its paw, as if the last 1,000 years of motion were no more interesting than a trip to the shop. Freya looks at you, not with pity or gratitude, but with knowing, as if she expects nothing, but accepts everything. They will take you the rest of the way, she says, and you are not sure if she means the cats or your dreams. You step down. The moss under your feet feels warmer now. The cats do not vanish right away. They linger, tails curling into the mist like ink in warm water, watching you with half-lidded eyes that suggest both indifference and the weight of ancient contracts. You imagine somewhere in the vaults of Asgard, there is a scroll that binds them to their duties, and yet no clause about manners. You look over your shoulder. Freya is gone, or at least no longer visible. Perhaps she walks Folkvangr again, checking in on her warriors, or teaching yet another cat to drive a chariot. You suspect the latter is less about training and more about bribery, tuna-based diplomacy. The cats nudge you forward, not roughly. One leans its shoulder against your hip. The weight is immense, but comforting, like a weighted blanket designed by cosmic forces. Together, you begin to move. You travel through what feels like the edge of dream logic. Trees shimmer in and out of focus, leaves glinting like silver. The sky flickers between dusk and dawn, never quite landing on a decision. The path is made of things you remember but forgot you loved. Smells from childhood kitchens, the feeling of cold air after rain, the way a cat's purring can echo in your chest like a lullaby made of bees. As you walk, the air begins to hum. It is subtle at first, like the thrum of distant drums, or a heartbeat you did not notice until now. Then you realize it is the purr. The cats are singing, in their way, and the world answers. In Norse mythology, few creatures are assigned less glamour and more confusion than mythological steeds. Sure, Odin gets Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse who allegedly sprang from the world's weirdest love triangle. Thor has goats. Loki has himself, occasionally. But Freya, she picked cats, not tigers, not lions, domestic cats. Historians still argue whether this choice reflected a lost cultural reverence for felines in Norse society, or if it was a later, more poetic embellishment. Either way, it worked, because they are not just cats, they are hers. A fringe theory suggests the cats represent balance, symbols of both chaos and calm. One moment they are curled in your lap. The next, they have destroyed your best drinking horn because you dared to ignore them. They do not care for your rituals or expectations. They care for warmth, soft places to land, and hunting things that move slightly. You glance at the larger one. It blinks slowly at you. In cat terms, that is practically an affectionate poem. The scenery shifts again. You are back among trees, but this time they are not trembling with divine presence. They are just trees. Birds flit overhead. One of the cats sneezes loudly and looks personally offended by its own nose. The path levels out. Ahead, you see a clearing, a circle of stones, some carved, others left plain. A few have moss on them. One has a cat curled on top, sleeping like a loaf of bread with claws. You wonder how many such places exist, hidden pockets where gods once walked and their footsteps left echoing stillness behind. Freya's chariot does not arrive again, nor does it need to. The journey is complete. The cats walk to the edge of the circle and sit. One licks its chest with deliberate slowness. The other looks at you as if to say, well, go on then. You step into the circle. You half expect something dramatic, a beam of light, a bolt of thunder, maybe a cryptic riddle delivered by a passing squirrel. But nothing happens, not at first. Then the silence deepens. Not ominous, but reverent. The wind stills. Your heartbeat slows, like your body knows it is safe. You feel watched, but not judged, seen, but not measured. The way a cat watches you when you are sad, present, unmoving, understanding, in its own cryptic way. You sit, not because anyone told you to, but because it feels right. The stone is cool. The earth smells clean. The cats stay just outside the circle, like guardians at the edge of a secret. Here, in this unspoken space between myth and memory, you understand something. Not a prophecy, not a secret, just a knowing that sometimes the ones who carry the divine are not horses or chariots of fire. Sometimes they are creatures who knock things off tables for fun and still get worshipped. Sometimes the sacred rides in on a hiss and a twitching tail. Somewhere in the trees, a bird laughs, or maybe it is a trick of the wind. You breathe in, you close your eyes. The purring begins again. The air thickens with calm, like velvet wrapped around your thoughts. The last of the journey settles into your bones with a hush, not a bang. You hear the faint rustle of fur against stone, the softest exhale of a watching cat, and somewhere in the distance, the echo of goddess footsteps, already fading into the trees. The chariot has long since vanished, but its rhythm still lingers in your chest. Let it lull you. Let the warmth stretch and yawn through your limbs like a sun-drenched feline. Close your eyes now. The world is quiet. The story is done.